All right, hello everyone. Let me know if you can't hear me clearly or if you need the sound to go up and down. But I just wanted to say hello to everyone and kind of orient you guys to the platform and also introduce our wonderful speaker for tonight. All right, so first of all, the top chat box, you can use that for questions. Please be sure to reserve that only for questions for our speaker and use the bottom chat box if you need to communicate with me or with your fellow debaters. We also have links in between those two chat boxes. Those are provided by our speaker for your benefit. So that's basically how the platform is going to work. Now, to introduce our speaker, we've got Kurt Couchman. He is the Vice President of Public Policy at Defense Priorities. But most recently, before Defense Priorities, he was a legislative director for a Republican member of the House of Representatives. He's developed initiatives and built coalitions in diverse fields, such as foreign affairs, defense, trade, healthcare, transparency, housing finance, banking, and the budgeting process, including 2 bipartisan balanced budget amendments with more than 60 co-sponsors each. So he's the real deal, guys. He previously conducted legislative affairs for the Cato Institute, including expanding the influence of its foreign and defense policy scholars on Capitol Hill. He's advocated for private industry in the energy and the chemical fields. And he holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Indiana University of Pennsylvania and the Robert E. Cook Honors College, as well as a master's degree in economics from George Mason University, which is right down the road from the Bill of Rights Institute's headquarters. So I'm going to let Kurt take it away. Once again, if you've got any questions, please use that top box, and we'll go ahead and answer those throughout the webinar. All right, guys, take it away, Kurt.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. Okay, now I mute my speakers. Okay, are we all set now? I'm still hearing the echoing. There we are. Wait, let me try this. Okay, can you hear me through the computer now? Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that. First time using this platform, so I'm getting up to speed. Let me start again. Thank you to Maddie and the Bill of Rights Institute for hosting this event. Thank you to all the participants for being on the line. This is an important topic. I've been involved with the policy process for a while, and I hope I can provide something to you. Now, when we're thinking about the separation of powers between Congress and the President, the place to start is the Constitution. This is my Cato copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. When you look through it, Article 1, Section 8, it provides that Congress has the power to declare war. When you get to Article 2, where the President's powers are listed, it gives the power the commander-in-chief role. So his job is to command the armed forces once Congress has called them up for a war, and also to repel sudden attacks on the states, which at that time, of course, included not only foreign powers, but also Indian tribes and some others. Now, the United States hasn't declared war, Congress hasn't declared war, I should say, since World War II. Imperial Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, we declared war on them, they declared war on us, Germany, the US, on and on. And so that's the last time we declared war. There was no declaration of war or even authorization for use of military force with respect to the Korean conflict. President Truman deemed that a police action. And so, you know, there's an armistice, but there was never a declared war in the first place. So some legal scholars claim that that was an illegal war, and there's some ground for that. Then Vietnam happened. There was an authorization for use of military force there. It was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And there's a little bit of cloudiness about exactly what happened there. But the important point is that Congress did authorize that operation. Same with Desert Storm, the first Gulf War. President Bush sought and received approval from Congress to drive Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. Congress granted that. The U.S. military went in and pushed Saddam back, and then the soldiers came home and we had a military parade. Which leads us eventually to the September 2001 attacks on the United States. I was in college at the time. I was just coming out of the bathroom, the communal bathroom in college, getting ready for my classes, and I saw that some of my friends had their doors open. And I looked in the screen because they all looked kind of shell-shocked, and a plane had collided with the North Tower one of the towers of the Twin Towers in New York City. And we were all shocked and horrified, thinking it was some sort of a tragic accident. It was a beautiful, beautiful Tuesday day in September. Not a cloud in the sky practically. And so I finished getting ready. I headed over to the dining hall, and right about when I got there, a second plane crashed into the other tower. And that's when we knew. I mean, there was no question what was going on at that point. And then subsequently, we had a third plane hit the Pentagon not too long after that. And then the fourth plane went down in a field in Pennsylvania, only about an hour from where I was going to school, after passengers realized what was going on and tried to take control of the airplane back from the hijackers. We didn't know what was going on. It was the fog of war, it was a fog of uncertainty. No one had any idea where this was coming from, at least in the circles I ran in then. But Congress didn't really seem to know either. 3 days after the attacks, joint resolutions were introduced in both the House and the Senate authorizing the use of military force. They were both introduced on September 14th. There was an identical version in the House, identical version in the Senate. They both passed early in the day. The Senate one came over to the House. House then passed the Senate one on September 14th, 3 days after, and then it was presented to the President of the United States the next day, September 15th. Now, he didn't sign it into law until September 18th, a week after the attacks. But the public law, it's Public Law 10740, and I provided a link to that. It's SJ Res 23. That, the whereas clauses in that describe in very general terms what had happened. Whereas on September 11th, 2001, acts of treacherous violence were committed against the United States and its citizens. And whereas such acts render it both necessary and appropriate that the United States exercise its rights to self-defense and to protect United States citizens both at home and abroad. And whereas, in light of the threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States posed by these grave acts of violence, and whereas such acts continue to pose an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, and whereas the President has authority under the Constitution to take action to deter and prevent acts of international terrorism against the United States, now therefore be it resolved. And then there's the actual binding meat of the resolution. So my reason for bringing that up is to point out that we didn't know, Congress didn't really know exactly who was to blame and what needed to be done and how to tailor this thing. And so they passed something that was pretty general. It's just a short paragraph, so I'll read it to you. This is the resolve clause. In general, that the President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. Now that's pretty broad language. I mean, what specifics do we have in there? Very little. All we knew at the time, or all that Congress was willing to say publicly at that time, is that there'd been a horrible attack, the United States needed to defend itself, and that Congress authorized the President to go do that, at least against the terrorists who were responsible for 9/11. So, were there any limits on the activities that the President could pursue in achieving that? Well, what does all necessary and appropriate force mean? There are some elements of that in the Geneva Conventions and other international agreements that govern the laws of war. But in terms of domestic policy, it's a pretty broad statement. Now, how about the adversaries? Well, those nations, organizations, or persons that he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks. So what is the definition of aided? It's not there. What's the definition of organizations? How broad is an organization's reach? How does he determine those things? Now, it's true that there have to be some delegation of powers to the President so that he can go ahead and implement and execute the laws that Congress provides. But there should always be an intelligible principle, some sort of a limiting principle that clearly instructs the executive on the objectives to be achieved. Okay, was there any limitation with respect to geography? No, and at that time, there really couldn't have been. We didn't find out publicly until September 20th, which was 6 days after Congress had passed this and 2 days after the President signed it into law, that in fact it was Al-Qaeda, which was in Afghanistan and somewhat in Pakistan, and it was being, we believed, harbored by the Taliban. So there's no definition of who the adversaries are in this authorization for the use of military force. Now, how about a sunset provision? I didn't read a sunset provision. There's no sunset provision in there. And the way a law works, if a law is passed and a law is not repealed, then it continues on indefinitely until Congress modifies it or repeals it. There are some laws that are time limited, authorizing appropriations for 2 years, 5 years, whatever the case may be, but this has no sunset clause. And there is no statutory mechanism to create a sunset clause for authorizations for use of military force. Now, how about reporting? Is there even any kind of reporting that the president is required to do? In this, no, there is not. But it does state right after that part that I read that this is to be considered a specific statutory authorization under the War Powers Resolution of 1973. Now, the War Powers Resolution of 1973 was passed by Congress over President Nixon's veto because Congress was unhappy with the way things had been going in Vietnam. So there are some reporting requirements that are in there. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what the War Powers Resolution does. Some people think that it's unconstitutional because it constrains the president's so-called inherent authorities under Article 2 of the Constitution. I'm skeptical of that, as we'll come back to later. Some believe that the process for disapproving a military action that a president has embarked upon without congressional authorization, or at least without clear congressional authorization, is unconstitutional because it doesn't meet the presentment test in Article 1, Section 7, I believe. But there's people who dispute that as well. In any case, there is some reporting there. As you can see, the authorization for the use of military force that was passed in 2001 is quite broad. It's very general language. We didn't know who did it, where they were, what needed to be done. In principle, President Bush could have dropped nuclear weapons on, terrorists in caves in Afghanistan to deal with that, although that would have been, for many reasons, an improper thing to do, just from a policy perspective and from an international obligation perspective. But so it's pretty clear that Congress gave this authority to the president. It gives too much power to the president, doesn't it? I mean, it doesn't meaningfully constrain it in any way. The Congress could have come back subsequently, and they could have amended this once we knew that it was the Taliban who harbored al-Qaeda, and it was al-Qaeda that was the organizers, planners, and attackers on 9/11. That didn't happen. They could have also forced the issue by putting a sunset clause in. So, we'll provide this blanket authorization for right now. And again, remember that there is a little bit of a restriction that is to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by those people who are responsible. But they didn't do that. There was no sunset clause, and they didn't come back and repeal it or amend it. And so here we are. It is February 2018. It's 17 years later. There are men and women serving in the United States Armed Forces in Afghanistan that were literally infants and toddlers at the time that the 9/11 attacks happened. Some of you may not have been born at the time the 9/11 attacks happened. So quite clearly, on balance, the current authorization for use of military force gives too much power to the president. Or does it? Because remember, Congress passed the AUMF. Congress had the power to change the AUMF. Congress retains the power to change the AUMF. And there have been attempts. There have been a number of amendments offered to the annual National Defense Authorization Acts to constrain that, to put time limits on it. Representative Barbara Lee of California made news last year by proposing an amendment to an appropriations bill, spend money, that would have prohibited the use of funds under the act from being used under the September 11th, 2001 authorization for the use of military force. It actually passed by a voice vote in the House Appropriations Committee, but between the bill being approved by the Appropriations Committee and it being considered on the floor of the House of Representatives, the Rules Committee, which is a leadership committee that has a lot of power to change things or to determine the process by which measures are considered on the floor, they pulled that provision out. The Speaker suggested that the Foreign Affairs Committee would take this up expeditiously. Now, they have held a hearing. The House Foreign Affairs Committee has. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which has jurisdiction over this, has also held hearings, but nothing has come of it in terms of repealing, replacing, amending, repealing, that sort of thing. So one of the things that defense priorities we focus on a lot is that Congress must reclaim the war powers. The 2001 authorization for the use of military force was primarily initially used in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. It made sense to go after some of those folks as they fled into Pakistan, still well within the intention of Congress when passing that. It has subsequently been used in other places. Now, don't forget there was a 2002 authorization for the use of military force. If you go ahead and read that, then you'll see that that was focused on Saddam Hussein's government. And so in the actual authorizing language, when it talks about the threat posed by the government of Iraq, that was Saddam Hussein's government. After Saddam Hussein's government fell, there is no more utility to that authorization for use of military force. Am I still with you? My screen went dark for a second. Okay. I'll just have to touch my mouse every now and then. So, so there was that other AUMF. It went away because the purpose for which it was created was dealt with. So, if we're going to have an AUMF, it should be tailored towards the circumstances we now find ourselves in. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, was an outgrowth of a Sunni insurgency. It grew up after the Saddam Hussein government was brought down. It developed some very radical approaches to things. It was ultimately mostly defeated. We're still working on cleaning up some of it by a pretty broad coalition. The Iraqi people themselves bore the brunt of it. Iraqi Kurds, Syrian Kurds, the part of Syria's civil war that is allied with the government, they were very much involved, and some of the other countries in the region. I think Cameroon was a big one as well. The United States certainly was involved with that. Our casualties, I believe that 6 Americans were killed fighting ISIS, and another 16 were wounded. So the bulk of the face-to-face combat was done by other folks, but we were certainly involved with training, advising, assisting, providing artillery support, providing logistics, air cover, aerial strikes, lots of different things. And so partly as a result of that, there was a captain in the Army by the name of Nathan Smith. He sued President Obama in 2016, stating that there was no authority to conduct these operations under the 2001 authorization for use of military force. It's still working its way through the courts. It's now Nathan Smith versus President Trump, since he's now the commander-in-chief. But his point was that ISIS was not connected to the authorization for the use of military force that was passed after 9/11. They weren't in any way substantially supporting the planners, the plotters, the perpetrators, and so it's time to do a new AUMF if indeed that's something that should be done. Now, Iraq and Syria aren't the only places that this AUMF is being invoked. It's also being used in Yemen and also in Somalia and some other places as well. So the point that I would make on why the 2001 AUMF is not the thing that is responsible for giving too much power to the president is that first, Congress can change the laws anytime. They're always updating things, they're always amending things, but yet this one, they haven't. Now, there have been some efforts. Todd Young, a senator from Indiana, shortly after being sworn in the Senate, talked about how it was cowardice that they haven't done it. And now Senator Bob Corker, who's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said it wasn't cowardice, it's just that we couldn't get agreement, and without agreement, it wasn't going to be possible to move forward on that. But, it's not just Congress's fault. The presidents, and we're now talking about 3 presidents, President Bush, President Obama, and President Trump, have each relied on broad interpretations of executive powers. Now, if you go through and you look at the Constitution, Congress has a whole bunch of powers related to the preparation for and the declaration of war. The president's primary job is to be commander in chief of the armed forces when called into the actual service of the United States, and he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, the laws that Congress has passed. But presidents, counsel to presidents have often relied on broad ideas about what Article 2 of the Constitution allows the president to do. There's some Supreme Court case law on this. Sometimes, so there's a difference between holdings and dicta in court history. The holdings are the decisions that the members of the court sign on to, and those are binding on lower courts, and they are precedents that later Supreme Courts do rely on, although they can be overturned. Dicta is prose. Dicta is something that whoever wrote the opinion puts in there. They think it makes sense to making the case for the holding. And there is some pretty expansive dicta, prose, in certain cases. There was Curtis Wright Export Corporation versus the United States. That's one of the big ones. More recently, Zivotofsky versus Kerry. But note that the holdings, well, not so much in Zivotofsky, but in Curtis Wright, the holding itself didn't really touch that particular aspect, but it was the broader language of the dicta that did. Now, the other thing is that, you know, presidents often make signing statements saying that Congress shouldn't have included this or that provision in an Appropriations Act or some other act because it impinges on the president's authority. Now, that's all very good and interesting, but you have to understand that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 of the Constitution, better known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, says the following. It says that Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, so those are Congress's powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. And so that's why I provided to you an article that I recently had published in The Hill. The title is No Presidential Power is Beyond Congress. Because under that necessary and proper clause, Congress actually can pass anything that it wants, anything that it can get agreement on, which can be challenging these days. But it can pass laws that condition and structure the president's exercise of his authorities, whether they are specified in the Constitution or whether they are provided pursuant to a power that the Constitution grants to Congress. So there's really nothing that is outside of the legal scope, the constitutional scope of what Congress can do. It's really a question of prudence and temperance and making sure that the president has the latitude that is appropriate for the job. And Congress has gone too far. And so this authorization for use of military force, that's words on paper. That's not holy writ. It's not carved on stone. Congress can change that. The president could also refuse to do things that he didn't think Congress had clearly authorized. It says the AUMF says that the president is authorized to use, not that he must, not that he has a responsibility to. Clearly, morally, there was a responsibility to go after the attackers and the people that aided them. But the president could say, look, I don't have the power to go into Syria. And so if we're going to do that, then I need Congress to step up and do that. And that's exactly what President Obama did, to his credit. He didn't do that in Libya, but he did do it in Syria. He said, I would like Congress to provide me an authorization to remove Bashar al-Assad from power and create a new coalition government. And seeing how not so well things were going in Afghanistan and Iraq, Congress was not inclined to do that. Because of ISIS, however, and related things, President Trump has put American forces into Syria. There's a serious constitutional question about that. Defense priorities, we are of the view that that is not an appropriate thing to do, that is in fact an unconstitutional action because Congress hasn't approved going into Syria. And of course there was the bombing of the Shayrat air base in Syria with the Tomahawks after President Trump decided that there was sufficient evidence that Assad had used chemical weapons against his own. So it's been expanding, it's been creeping along over the time. Now, what is the way forward? We've got a political culture problem. It's not just Congress, although that's part of it. It's society-wide. There's a lot of things that people care about, right? So it's not entirely the American people aren't entirely to blame for the Congress and the president doing things abroad that, by and large, don't directly impact the American people all that much, at least directly. There are some serious concerns about how we can sustain our civil liberties in a time of perpetual war. And there have been some legislative vehicles that have eroded some of those or have not fixed problems that have been uncovered. Recently, the Congress has passed legislation reauthorizing some foreign intelligence surveillance authorities that many members found very problematic, but the majority decided to keep them and expand them. So, part of it is the way that the House and the Senate are organized and what the incentives facing members are. Sometimes, even though it might be the right thing to do, there's a lot of pressures on members, and that's hard to resist sometimes, especially when your leadership, when the Republican leadership, when the Democratic leadership, and when a lot of people that you trust are telling you that the thing that you don't want to do is the thing that you should do. I think another part of the problem here is that there isn't really an organized way to force trade-offs. Just tonight, the Congress is debating a budget deal that would raise the caps under the Budget Control Act quite significantly, about $300 billion over the next 2 years, perhaps more. I haven't seen the CBO report for that yet. But if we had to consider trade-offs between, should this thing be going on in country X on the other side of the world, or should we use those funds domestically, whether it's for deficit reduction or for tax reduction or to spend on something else, then that might actually force a debate about whether these things are worth it or not. All right. At this point, I think I'd be interested in taking any questions that folks have. I think you can use your platform here to pose them, and I will patiently wait for them. I should also say that it's not just the president's fault and Congress's fault. The courts have a role to play in this as well. Some of the questions have arisen due to the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay. There have been habeas petitions. Habeas is a process by which someone who is being incarcerated can appeal for the adjudication of their case and potentially to be released because of the 2001 authorization for the use of military force and subsequent legislation that has expanded the definition of what's meant by associated forces. The courts have generally deferred to Congress and the president over a so-called political issue. President Trump recently signed an executive order stating that persons from ISIS who are now captured can be brought to Guantanamo Bay for interrogation and to be held indefinitely. And we'll see what happens there. It may be that the courts will decide at this point to get involved and require Congress to modify or replace the AUMF. So you've heard me talk about how, on balance, the current AUMF gives too much power to the president. It does, but that is kind of a phenomena. That's an outgrowth of deeper problems of congressional inaction and of presidential overreach. Both of those things are there. There's been a long-term trend for Congress to defer to the executive branch. And there are some reasons for that, as the federal government's scope, as the activities that it's involved in have grown. It becomes increasingly difficult for members of Congress and their staff to intelligently structure specific rules. And so it becomes easy to just kick it over to the executive branch agencies and let them worry about it. That's politically useful as well, because that means that members of Congress can be behind, a broad principle like we support clean air, we support clean water, or you should go get those terrorists that attacked us on September 11th. But it doesn't really provide the executive branch with clear direction, and so that's where the mischief in the executive branch starts to come from. They're given broad instructions, and then it's up to the agency personnel and ultimately the political appointees and potentially even the president to decide whether or not it makes sense to do that. So, any questions? Maddie, is there anything that you'd like me to touch on that I haven't yet? Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. I have provided some readings that should be useful to you. It's not just Congress's duty to taxpayers, but also service members to make sure that they're grappling with these questions and answering them in an appropriate way that serves America's national security interests and provides a return to the American people. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Kurt. This was really, really helpful. Now, for all the attendees, this is going to go up on our YouTube page, so you can always post questions in the comments of that YouTube. We will also have the links to all of his resources that Kurt has provided in the caption for the YouTube video. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email right in the chat box. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you guys might have, whether it's about more other debate webinars or if it's about any other Bill of Rights Institute programs. We have another webinar coming up on February 15th. The speaker is Matt Zwolinski. He is one of the leading experts in the universal basic income, or universal base income. So that should be really interesting. It's going to be a really fun webinar. So thank you guys for coming. And once again, please reach out if you have any questions. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.